Giagwit, hello. Welcome to the podcast series of the Center for Irish Studies at Villanova University. My name is Joseph Lennon, Emily C. Riley, Director of the Center.
And I'm Jennifer Joyce, Associate Director and Curator of this series. We appreciate the support from our many donors, especially a generous grant from the Connolly Foundation.
This podcast series brings to listeners a rich variety of Irish Studies topics. Our Villanova Center for Irish Studies spans 9 academic disciplines, and here our faculty and students talk with distinguished thinkers, artists, writers, academics, political leaders, and other campus visitors.
We really appreciate our ongoing community support. Thank you so much for listening. If you are looking to attend a live Irish Studies event, please join us on Villanova's campus during the academic year for our free event series. You can follow us on social media, find us at our website where you can sign up for our newsletter, or you can always email us at irishstudies@villanova.edu. Welcome to the Villanova Center for Irish Studies podcast, Season 4, Episode 2. I'm Dr. Jennifer Joyce, the Associate Director for the Center for Irish Studies at Villanova University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I'm pleased to have with me our guest for today's episode, Rosie O'Gorman from Cow House Studios in County Wexford in Ireland. Rosie O'Gorman was born and raised in Wexford. Time spent on the farm as a child with her 3 sisters encouraged her love of inventive playfulness. Rosie is a mother of 2 delightful boys, Michael and Emmet. She is an artist, a dedicated teacher, and her ancestral home is now the place where Cow House Studios resides. Rosie attended the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, receiving her BA in Art and Design education. During that time, she became devoted to making contemporary art relatable and personally meaningful to her students. She was awarded 2 National Irish Awards, the Larkin Memorial Award for her teaching and the Taylor Award for her painting. From Dublin, she moved to San Francisco, where she received her MFA from San Francisco Art Institute with the support of a Fulbright Scholarship. Her practice grew to include drawing, painting, installation, and sculpture. Through Cow House Studios, Rosie shares her home, family, and her love of art and education. Cow House Studios is a progressive artist-run school and residency set in the farmland of County Wexford, Ireland. A productive farm to this day, the 180 acres of land provide an authentic and inspirational backdrop while facilitating multidisciplinary practices for artists in residence and students, focusing on cross-cultural learning and creative exchange. Cow House Studios supports contemporary visual arts practice. They hope to foster a deep curiosity for one's surroundings and encourage further engagement with the creative process as a catalyst for independent thought. To this end, Cow House provides art education for children, teens, and adults, facilities for colleges, schools, and artist-led groups, and an artist in residence program for professional artists. Welcome, Rosie, to our podcast. It's lovely to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jenny. I'm delighted to be with you this morning.
Yes, and you and I met several years ago because we have started a collaboration with Villanova and Cow House, bringing some of our study abroad students to your delightful place there in the hills of County Wexford. Our Dublin internship program through the Learning Communities Abroad comes as a component of studying contemporary Ireland through expressions of art. But what I was thinking our listeners might be interested in hearing is a little bit about how, on this 180-acre farm in Wexford, Ireland, and all of your travels around the world, becoming the artist and educator that you are, you have a little bit of a connection to the main line here in Villanova.
Yeah, a very direct connection, I would say. So my husband, Frank Abercy, is from Gladwin. His parents grew up in South Philly, but he grew up in Gladwin. And so I was very familiar with the area where Villanova is located before we actually even were in touch many years ago. Frank's older sister, Audrey, and his brother-in-law both attended Villanova for their undergraduate studies. So I was familiar with the school. And it was really, I was excited for many reasons, like to connect with the school, that a space that we were familiar with. And obviously Frank's family were too, and have a very personal connection, but also to work with students who weren't necessarily coming from an art background. So I thought that was a really there was a lot of really interesting and kind of great ways to connect with Villanova.
Yeah, well, we're so happy. I know the students, whenever I ask them after their 8 weeks in Ireland, what some of the highlights are, they always cite Cow House and their experience there with the animals, with the art, with you and Frank and the boys, and of course Katrina's cooking. So you mentioned that some of the students like ours at Villanova who might not specify in artistic practices come to Cow House, but you also have a variety of residencies for artists themselves, for other student programs. But before we get into sort of the nitty gritty of what Cow House offers, I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about how Cow House kind of came to be, like how you and Frank envisioned this space, and how you have a really commendable mission and focus on sustainability and the ways that you live and work there on the farm.
Yeah, well, we try. So I'll talk about how I suppose the seeds germinated for the ideas of transforming a working family farm into the studio and a space that supports art on all kind of different levels. So when I was an undergraduate student myself in Dublin and NCAD, my father converted part of one of the old buildings into a studio for me to kind of come home at the weekends and paint and make a mess outside of the house. And then both my younger sisters actually also went on to study art education. There's 4 girls in my family. 3 of us went to art school for my dad's sins. And so my older sister's a nurse, but the 3 of us going to art college meant he was interested in kind of converting some of the barns and the spaces that were kind of used for storage. They weren't really used like as stables or as, by workmen anymore. And so that space was there. And I think my parents dreamed that maybe we'd come back someday and start something on the farm. But to be honest, when I was in my early 20s, I was like, woohoo, and I headed off to San Francisco. I wasn't really thinking about it at that time, to be honest. I kind of wanted to spread my wings and explore and make art in a different context. So really when Frank and I met, we were both in our early 20s, and there's this kind of funny story, which I'll tell you, where Frank and I were sitting on the Muni in San Francisco. We weren't dating very long, and I was with my cousin Ashley, who I'm very close with, and she lives in New York. And she was talking to me about, do you ever think you'll go back on the farm and maybe start some art classes? And I was like, maybe not yet. I kind of still in a space where I'm exploring my own work and enjoying being away. And Frank said he heard that conversation very early on. We only had started dating. And in his head, he was like, that's an amazing idea, but I don't want to say it to Rosie that I'll do it because I might scare her off. But anyway, so as our, relationship developed, we did start talking very early on and very seriously about these 2 particular buildings on the farm and how they would make really wonderful spaces to host artists. As artists ourselves, we really wanted to kind of surround ourselves with that kind of a creative process once we left grad school, because it can be very hard, I think, when you leave any kind of studies to maintain the space and the beautiful bubble of learning and exchange. So we were kind of thinking ahead with that, but also we were both really interested in education, and that was going to allow us to generate a model that was sustainable financially, which I can talk about in a minute. So we approached my dad about the space of the 2 buildings. One, the Cow House, as it's named after, was always known as the Cow House. It's an old space that would have been used to house cattle during the winter when they'd be fed indoors. When my great-grandfather built it in 1915, so it's a really beautiful granite stone building. It's not going anywhere, but it definitely was always conceived as being an agricultural building. But we saw the potential, and thankfully so did my dad, especially. Like, he has as a farmer, he farmed since he was a teenager, but he was always very visual and always making things for us as children. But he has the ability to visualize like a dirty, dark, space that's covered in cow dung as a studio. Wow. And then the accommodation, which is what we call the barn. So those 2 buildings sitting side by side, and he was very open to it. And that's kind of, there was lots of months and years of making sketches and notebooks and kind of secretly having conversations between myself and Frank. But when we did eventually approach my parents, maybe about a year and a half opening to us having chats about it. They were very open to it, to the idea.
That's
Um,
wonderful. That was
yeah.
wonderful that they were so receptive to this. I mean, and to have a dream like that, right? This vision that the two of you kind of create, and to have the whole family involved. It's really clear, like when you're there living at Cow House as a guest, it
Yeah.
feels like you're part of the family. It feels like, we've met your dad, Michael. We've been part of the landscape, I think. And I also think you should mention that the resident, or I'll mention that the residence is not some casual, like we'll throw off, oh, and then there's the residence hall, but it is, or accommodations, I think was
Yeah.
the word you used. I mean, everything is so beautifully, tastefully done, and it's got to me, a simplistic kind of architecture about it, and in that way, though, it's so warm and inviting with what I don't know, you filled it with. And I think the group feels it immediately, and I'm sure all of your groups and artists feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, we lived in the building for 6 years, like alongside, because our programming was much smaller for the first few years. So we lived in it full time. And I do feel like it is like our home still, like it's very cozy there. I should mention too, and it's reminding me of like when talking about all the stuff in the barn, because we wanted to feel like home, because sometimes our guests are there for 3 months. But as part of the planning and the kind of, you know, trying to make it sustainable for in different ways, and definitely in the beginning, we had to figure out a way to make it balance. And we were interested in kind of having a non-for-profit side and then a for-profit side that allowed us to balance how we kind of were able to maintain the space. But we spent 2 years alongside renovating, writing a business plan, which was awful in some ways. It was like pulling teeth. The two of us went to art school, but Drew Casey, my brother-in-law, who went to Villanova, was really instrumental in that. And he helped us kind of understand and just break it down. And we worked through that. And it was a really, coming from a space, and like in Ireland, there's a lot of public funding. Now, obviously, it can change from year to year, but it was really important to Frank and I to maintain kind of autonomy over the space, but also to make it functional. And Drew was really instrumental in that as well. There was lots of kind of different, Cow House, I suppose we had lots of ideas about how to make it work, but we were really fortunate to have lots of my dad's building expertise, Drew's kind of business expertise, and then people mucking in. So, and then my sisters obviously did lots of stone pointing of walls. So, we were very lucky to have all those people around us who were supporting our vision too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And the family, I mean, you and Frank and your boys, and then your sisters all live close by to the farm.
It's a bit of a
So,
commute. Yeah.
so at least, it's an easy commute.
Yeah. Both my younger sisters work for us now. Edel, since Michael was born, he's almost 11. And then Sinead came on about 5 years ago. So it is. And it kind of they're personally very invested in what they do, but then also when people come to the space, it gives a sense that it really is a family environment. And that's something that we want to carry through in terms of how we eat meals together and the food that the food and the meals that we create for everybody. And just, I suppose I could talk about the sustainability now that you had asked me about earlier. And I suppose that's something that's really come to. So there's so many different ways you can think about sustainability, and like it's constantly reevaluating the practices that we have. Like in the beginning, it was definitely how to make this sustainable financially. And that was always a big, concern. And we worked really hard. And then as things we kind of grew, we were thinking about how can we look at how we sit in the landscape more. And obviously with environmental issues coming to the forefront in the last number of years, it's something that we really think about. So one of the things that COVID actually, I suppose, allowed us to do was, because we had to slow down, we kind of reevaluated how we were serving food. And, it does take time to do this research, but reflecting on what you do has become something that we used to always do, but as you get busier, it can become a little harder. I think it's so important with any line of work or study that you have time to reflect on it. So we started researching just all local producers as much as we could. So, local organic farm named Gorse Farms, run by two wonderful women. So we get a lot of our greens from there. The farmers market in Escorthy is where we source most of our fruit and vegetables. Local dairy farms. So it really, we were always really focused on serving good food, but then how do we kind of elevate it while also supporting smaller producers and local businesses. And so it also challenges you to work within certain boundaries, and creativity always, I think, excels when you have certain limitations. But then things like the farm, like my dad officially retired about 4 years ago now. And so he has about just under 200 acres. Most of it is leased out to two younger dairy farmers. My father would have had traditionally a beef cattle farm, or a ranch, as you might say in the States. And so most of the land is leased out, but he does have 50 acres of that land that is a forest. And it would be a typical Sitka spruce monoplantation, meaning one tree species. And so, but there has been a shift kind of in forestry practice within Europe. So we are interested in kind of how we can kind of create a more sustainable way for this forest moving forward. I have a growing interest in regenerative agriculture. So I think my dad would think that's really funny that I'm interested in farming now, 40 years later, having ran away from the farm as a teenager,
Right.
to live in a city. But I think it comes from also having two young boys and they're interested in the natural world. I'm really grateful that my kids get to grow up in the countryside, and they love that. And we're very lucky that my sisters have their kids and their cousins are around. But it's really about seeing a space for them moving forward too, and looking at how we treat the landscape. So it really is part of a lot of how we talk with our students. Like, being an artist is not just about making a painting, it's about how you look at the world. And your creativity can really impact how people not only think about or look at the world, but also how they interact with it. So yeah, it's something that's constantly evolving. I was introduced to a document called the Earth Charter 2 years ago. I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with it, but as a guiding kind of document for us, the things that we want to pay attention to, it's been really great as well.
Yeah, and that was also introduced to the students and me when we were visiting you, right? And we interacted and went with one of your artists, Kathy Fitzgerald,
Yeah.
to her Hollywood forest, and talked about what eco art might look like. And so, maybe this would be a good time for you to tell us just a little bit more about the types of contemporary Irish artists that you bring or draw to Cow House, and what types of educational. I mean, you mentioned a little bit of ideology, but are you and Frank always the ones teaching? Do groups bring teachers? Do the artists that you have in residence teach the students that come? So maybe just say a little bit more about the sort of flow of
Yeah,
experience there.
well, it could be any or all of those things that you described, because like we are really open to like working with educators, working with artists, and it really depends on what like we can bring to a group experience or what is needed like for curriculum reasons. So with Villanova, what's always been really great, and it was really interesting because it was really the first time we worked with a group who weren't necessarily coming with an arts experience. But Frank and I fundamentally have always believed that like whatever you get from making art, you can take forward with you into any profession, in terms of making something from nothing and critical thinking and analysis and learning how to explore the world visually, or just working with your hands. Like, you learn so much from being in the world. So it was really interesting. And I loved the idea of, learning about Ireland through the arts and, your focus on literature, but then the visual arts as a complement to that. Because, people come to Ireland can have like sometimes that, we all have, I suppose, images in our head when we travel somewhere, but to kind of go a little bit deeper, I felt through art could be really great, while also having fun and just letting them make art and do something that allowed them to get out of their headspace too, and just enjoy it. So we had certain artists I know we've brought our students to visit or have come to Cow House to share their work. And so something like Kathy Fitzgerald, who you mentioned, comes from a science background, and she has developed an eco-social art practice. And she actually introduced me to the Earth Charter many years ago. But her practice, I felt like, touched on many things. Like, her interest in science grew to kind of be involved in, going to get a visual art degree. But then she became very politically involved with the Green Party as a way to kind of bring her interests kind of into more of a public space. And her practice really involves a level of activism too, but it exists within the visual art context, as well as maybe politics and, environmental spaces. And then somebody like Robert Ellis, who's a really wonderful photographer and just a really fun person to be around,
Yes.
Robert, you know, as an artist and photographer himself, he's traveled to I think it was Uganda a number of years ago, and being, you know, a foreigner in a land where he's not native, and really kind of questioned how he can photograph and what is he looking at, and then how do his photographs speak of being somebody in a strange place. And so I think that was really valuable to think about how you can look beneath the surface, but also the images you take will speak of your experience, but also maybe what they speak of around them. And then I'm trying to go through my head now who else we've worked with over the years. So for those two artists, for example, at Villanova, I felt like they were kind of giving a perspective that is actually very current. It's like something that's really in the psyche of what people are thinking about in Ireland, like whether it's environment or how, you know, Ireland might be portrayed internationally. But we also touched on politics and religion with different artists too. Like working with Anne Maria Healy, one of our first years when it was the repeal of the eighth referendum. And I think, you know, to talk about difficult things, I think is really important too. And there's a nice if we try and strike that balance. But then when it comes to other groups, we might work with a teacher to develop the curriculum. Frank and I'd say for 99% of our programs are leading the curriculum, and we'll make suggestions, and we'll work with the staff or a teaching faculty to develop a program that works with what their interests, you know, how it aligns with their interests.
Well, I know that that the students from Villanova, the experience that they're given in learning from you, from Frank, from these artists that you bring to them, it dovetails so well with the sort of experiential learning, right, that they're getting while studying abroad, but also just sort of expanding their understanding of contemporary Ireland in ways that are so palpable because they're actually there creating art, they're asking questions, they're seeing the artists make what it is that they're drawn to. And so, you know, for a sort of literature and culture class, a lot of people always kind of say, well, you know, why would you go to an artist residency? But it's so much more than that because of that educational framework and the way that you're thinking about this, and that ideology of artistic practice that you're talking about, where it's sort of you're immersing yourselves in it, but you're also living it out in a daily way, and what that looks like. And I think too, for any budding artists out there, right, you should definitely check out Cow House as a place of your own residency. So sometimes you take artists mainly visual or
Well, I would say with our own kind of background as visual artists, most of the programs we support would be visual arts practices. But just to touch on what you're saying, that like for me, like being an artist really is, regardless if you use paint or sculpture or make crazy performances or sit and stare at a blank wall, it's about how you're curious about the world. So Frank and I are really open to what a visual arts practice can look like. So sometimes it might be a painting on a wall, and that's, I think, you know, what a lot of people think of when they think of art, but it's really broad, and Frank and I are really open. It probably comes from our years in San Francisco making art, where it was a really eye-opening experience. And Frank and I would see Cow House as our practice too. You know, we feel like we bring all of our, I suppose, interests and curiosities and skills as artists to what we do at Cow House. So, you know, it's very fluid in that way. And so for young artists, or for any age artists, the residencies would be suitable for people mostly from a visual arts perspective. So we host writers, we host like theatre performers, we've hosted musicians. So the residencies really are, and I suppose sometimes people are familiar with the word residency in terms of maybe a medical practice or a medical study. But in the art world, residency refers to time and space to focus on making art. Now, sometimes they're artist run, sometimes they're publicly funded, sometimes they're privately funded, sometimes there's grants available. They kind of are for many art forms. So you get musical residencies or writers residencies, but it really is time and space for an artist to make work, but then also to connect with a community of, like, you know, peers who are going to be exchanging ideas, and it becomes this really kind of precious space. And in some ways it's like an extension of what we had in grad school, but in a different way. So yes, we would host mostly visual artists, but I'm always open to questions too. I just had a musician email me this morning. The Cow House is not very soundproof, like it's granite walls, but people always have to, adjust their practice coming to Ireland anyway. So yes, mostly visual artists, but any creative practitioner can apply.
Yeah, it's so cool to see how it's evolved. It started in 2014 when you opened?
No, we opened in 2009.
2009. So it's been how many years? Quite a while.
Yeah,
12,
this is
13.
2000. Oh no, sorry, 2008. 2000. We got married in 2007 in the studio, and then our first summer was 2008. We kind of we like when Katrina, who cooks with Frank, came on full time, that really allowed us to expand our programming, and we were building. But yeah, we were 2008. I know. Wow. Like a long time.
Wonderful. Congratulations. And yeah, just to speak to Katrina and Frank's food, for people who are interested in recipes, Rosie has some of the Cow House recipes posted on their website, right?
Frank just posted a really lovely one actually, which comes from, it's a family recipe from his grandfather. And we did an event last month for a friend who was opening a new art space, and she wanted to take over a cafe. So she asked Frank to serve the food. And it's called Italian wedding soup. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yeah, sure.
Like, nobody here knew what it was. So I had to look up what is Italian wedding soup. And in the research, because his grandfather used to make it on Christmas Eve or over Christmas. And it was discovered that the wedding refers to cheap cuts of meat wedded to the greens, because it usually has cavalonero. So it's nothing to do with like getting married. So, but it was just really fun to.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah, so because people were like, why is it called wedding soup? And in Wexford, they were like wondering, or in Wicklow. So that recipe just went up, and those posts on our website generally come from recipes that are really loved by our guests as well.
So that's cowhousestudios.com. Yes.
And under there's a recipe section under culture.
And then you're also on social media, Instagram.
We are. Yeah, there's an Instagram and a Facebook account. And then under the culture section on the website, which we will post on social media too, we do interviews with former students and artists. So it's kind of a nice way for people to get an idea of, like, maybe 5 or 10 years later, how their time at Cow House has impacted or how they reflect on it. So that's a nice space if people are curious too.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. So, I mean, I'm sure that there are artists who have come back and said, my time there was instrumental. I don't know if there's one that stands out that you want to mention, or people can go and read the.
Yeah, we kind of call it our Cow House community. So sometimes they're former summer students who will be with us as a 15 or 16-year-old. And then
that's really great.
10 years later. So we've had students who are, I suppose we've been around this long now with students in their 30s, like, yourself, like everybody. Students stay the same age, but we get older. But there are adults out there in the world somewhere. But we did have one student one summer, her name was Taylor. I think Taylor was from the Northeast, maybe Connecticut. And her mum talked about how she was a high school student, and in her senior year, she was kind of advised not to take a beginner's photography class. And her mum was kind of sad because she'd come back from Cow House really loving photography, because she'd gone around and taken photographs of the neighbours here surrounding us on the farm. And she was quite a shy young woman. And she went a few years later, then when she went home, her mother emailed us and told us that she'd actually gone to their summer house and started doing the same thing. And kind of as a way to kind of meet and get to know her neighbours, she was going around her neighbourhood where she didn't really know people and taking photographs. And I always loved that idea that, and that's kind of, it was very direct. It was like a summer or two later. Sure. But we would often have parents use the word transformative. And I do believe that sometimes it can take time for the experience to settle and for people to look back and see maybe where it is. But we've lots of stories like that. And Taylor's one always stuck out to me because she just kind of was, her shy personality went beyond, she kind of did something that made her feel uncomfortable here. Frank suggested she go talk to the neighbors she didn't know. But being in that space of discomfort is something we generally encourage, because when you're there, you have to figure things out. And pushing your boundaries. So that's one small story, but
Yeah, I love it. And it also brings us back to that concept of reflection and how important it really is. Um and maybe we'll close, Rosie. This has been just so wonderful, but I'm wondering if you want to leave our listeners with some advice about art or artistic expression, especially for those of us like me who don't have a daily practice.
yeah, well, thinking about that, because it could be hard, right, with anything in life to kind of have a positive daily practice. But I do believe, and I know, and anybody who has a creative practice, whether that's writing or cooking or painting, whatever that is, when you're in that space where you're making something and you kind of forget about everything around you. And for me, like one of the most fundamental things about visual art is through drawing, like where you can forget about what your worries might be in your mind, but then also you're connecting with yourself and with the world around you. And drawing can look like many things. It could be doodles on a page, or it could be like, you're drawing a nude model. It doesn't have to be something serious. But Frank, my husband, actually has a really diligent daily practice where he journals every day and he makes some little notes about the day and he does it one drawing a day. And I think to remember that everybody can draw, like it doesn't matter, and you don't have to share it with anybody, but to maybe, you know, just as a way to kind of not be distracted by maybe what's in front of you, but also to focus in on yourself. I think 5 minutes a day, try it, see what happens, draw something. Doesn't matter what it is, you don't have to even show anybody. But I just really believe that there's a lot of value in drawing because it's a real, we've been doing it for tens of thousands of years and it's a really wonderful activity. So
I love it. That's great advice. And I think it's going to inspire many of us to sort of seek out that inner artist, and not worry so much about, who's going to see it or what it would look like. And so
yeah.
uh, keep doing what you're doing there in your little haven in Wexford, because it's really changing lives and making a difference. And it's serving, to me, Cow House Studios serves as such a model of of creativity, but done the right way. And so the way that you're inspiring young artists, new artists, and even those seasoned who keep returning, we're just so grateful here at Villanova to be your partner. And I would encourage anyone listening to reach out to Rosie O'Gorman at Cow House Studios if you're interested in partnering with them or visiting. I know the schedule is quite packed these days because it's a coveted space, but it is certainly one of those unique experiences that's hard to describe over a podcast. You have to go there and really see for yourself. But I think we did a pretty good job today, right,
I think
Rosie?
you're right. And there's always like a picture speaks 1,000 words. So photographs, and there's lots of images on the website. But yeah, Jenny, we always really love hosting your students from Villanova, and obviously to work with you is a real pleasure as well, and to get to know you over the years. And I'm always happy to answer questions. And just to finish on one thing, we have actually started building in time to reflect on our own programming, and that's something we've become really conscious of, and we feel like it's really important. As teachers and artists ourselves to make Cow House, to improve what we do. So that's something. So there's always quiet weeks there. People want to stop by for a cup of tea. Yeah,
Wonderful. Well, thanks a million, Rosie, for everything. And best of luck to you. And we'll see you this summer.
we will. Thanks very much, Jenny.